It all started on a calm Saturday morning. I had just moved into my new townhouse 3 weeks earlier. A fresh start in a quiet neighborhood. That was the plan, peace, tranquility. A community where I could finally relax. After years of apartment noise and landlord headaches, I didn't know I had just stepped into a war zone, disguised as a suburban paradise. The first 2 weeks were peaceful. I kept to myself, unpacked my boxes, met a few neighbors, all seemed fine. Nothing weird, until I got a knock on my door from a woman holding a clipboard, dressed like a budget mall cop. She wore sunglasses on a cloudy day, a beige wall vest and a permanent scowl. Her name was Karen, no real. That was actually her name. Karen, with short, aggressively cut hair and a voice that sounded like it lived on complaint hotlines. She didn't greet me with a hello or welcome to the neighborhood. No, she launched right into her reason for stopping by. She said there was an outstanding balance of $184.36 on the wall account for my property. Something about pest control and common area maintenance. I told her politely that I hadn't received any invoices. I had just moved in. The paperwork during the closing didn't mention any unpaid dues. She stared at me like I had just kicked her cat. She said that regardless of what I thought, the property carried the debt, and that is the new homeowner. I was responsible for it. Now listen. I'm all for paying my share. I don't mind chipping in for things that keep the community clean and functional. But this bill wasn't mine. It wasn't even for services during my ownership. It was for a rat removal that happened 2 months before I bought the house. I calmly said that I wasn't going to pay someone else's pest control bill. That's when her eyes narrowed and she leaned in real close. She told me if I didn't pay immediately, she'd have no choice but to escalate the situation. I raised an eyebrow. Escalate over $184. I asked her what exactly she meant by that, and that's when she smiled, a cold little smirk that said she'd been waiting for someone like me. She said, I'll just let the board know you're refusing to cooperate. We have procedures for these things. I closed the door gently but firmly, figuring that was the end of it. I thought she'd go back to wherever, walk Karen's recharge and leave me alone. I was wrong, so very wrong. The next morning, I found a bright orange violation notice taped to my garage door. It said I was in violation of Section 12A, neglecting financial responsibility to the association. I was stunned. They actually made a form for this kind of nonsense. I took the notice, crumpled it up, and tossed it in the trash. I figured again this was just posturing. No real legal ground, but Karen wasn't done. 2 days later I got another visit. This time she had someone with her, a man in a polo shirt, who looked like he hadn't smiled since 1993. He introduced himself as the watch treasurer. His name was Doug and he spoke like he was always out of breath. Karen stood there, arms crossed, while Doug read off some policy jargon about community bylaws and liens and failure to comply, resulting in enforcement action. I interrupted him and asked point blank, "Are you seriously threatening to take action over a rat that I didn't authorize and didn't benefit from?" Karen said, "It's about the principle of ownership. The property needs to be clear of debt, and if I don't pay, it shows I don't respect the community." I told them both that respect works both ways. I said I wouldn't be paying for a service I never requested, and I wasn't intimidated by threats of action from a power-tripping neighborhood committee. Doug looked uncomfortable. Karen looked thrilled. They left with no further words. But I could feel it. Something in her demeanor told me she wasn't going to let this go. The next day I got an email from the wall. They'd officially voted to fine me an additional $50 for non-compliance, and they were warning that further refusal would result in a report being filed to appropriate authorities. What authorities? I thought animal control over a rat bill. I responded to the email with a scanned copy of my closing documents, proving the service was performed before I even owned the property. I cited local housing law that stated no owners are not liable for undisclosed debts incurred prior to purchase. I thought logic would settle this. It didn't. 2 days later, I was outside trimming my hedges when a police cruiser rolled up. I thought maybe something had happened in the neighborhood. Maybe someone got their mailbox smashed again, or a dog got loose. Nope, the officer walked up to me and asked if I was the homeowner. I said yes. He told me that someone from the homeowners association had reported financial fraud and potential harassment of board members. I blinked. Financial fraud? What was he talking about? He said the wall claimed I had signed an agreement to cover the dues and then refused in bad faith, and had verbally harassed the wall president during a routine compliance conversation. That's when I realized what this was. Karen had called 911 on me because I refused to pay her rat bill. And now there was a real police report with my name on it. I explained everything to the officer, I showed him the emails, the documents. I even showed him the pest control receipt with the date, 2 months before I moved in. To his credit, he looked thoroughly annoyed. Not at me, but at the fact he had to waste time on this. He said no charges would be filed, but he had to file a report anyway because 911 was used to initiate the complaint. He left shaking his head. I stood there in disbelief. Karen watched the whole thing from her porch, sipping what I could only assume was lukewarm decaf with a sprinkle of petty. This was war. But she had no idea who she was messing with. I wasn't just some clueless new guy in the neighborhood. I had a plan, and it started with learning everything about how this war really worked. After the officer left and I watched Karen retreat inside her house with that smug expression, I knew I had two choices. I could roll over and pay the bill to shut her up, or I could do what I do best and gather every bit of leverage I could find. See, what Karen didn't know is that I work in contracts and compliance. I spent the last 10 years reviewing legal documents for a living. I know loopholes, I know procedure, I know how to keep records, and how to find the fine print that most people miss. So I started with the hose bylaws. I logged into the HOA portal, which was clunky and looked like it hadn't been updated since 2005. But the documents were all there. I downloaded the entire 48-page PDF and spent the rest of the day reading through it, line by line. That's when I started finding red flags. First red flag: the HOA president wasn't even elected legally. According to the bylaws, all board positions must be elected every 2 years, by a majority vote of the homeowners. But Karen had appointed herself as president after the previous one moved out. Second red flag: the fines they issued didn't follow protocol. They were supposed to send an official, certified notice and allow 10 business days for response before applying any financial penalties. I got an orange paper taped to my garage. That wasn't legal notification. Third and biggest red flag: the bill they were trying to force on me was never voted on by the board. It was a private contractor job that Karen arranged personally and built to the wall without approval. I realized something else too. She'd been doing this to other neighbors. I started asking around, and sure enough, 3 different homeowners told me they'd paid small bills in the past. They never understood, just to avoid drama. One even said Karen charged her $75 for a fence alignment inspection. Whatever that means. I documented everything. I made copies, screenshots, audio recordings of neighbors describing their stories. I compiled it all into a neat folder labeled Karen Fraud File. And then I found the biggest ace in the hole: public records. I went to the county website and pulled up public financial disclosures for the HOA bank account, which every registered HOA must file annually if they're incorporated as a nonprofit. Guess what? The HOA hadn't submitted any financial disclosures for the past 2 years. That's illegal. They were operating as a rogue board. Karen and her little crew weren't just petty and they were possibly committing financial crimes. But I wasn't going to report her just yet. I wanted her to make one more move, so I waited. Sure enough, a few days later, I received a final notice of collection slipped into my mailbox. Not even mailed legally, just hand-delivered, which is another violation. It said that unless I paid the full $184.36 and the additional $50 late fee by Friday, the HOA would be forwarding my case to their legal representative. That was it. Game on. I contacted a real estate attorney I'd worked with during my house purchase and explained the situation. He was more than happy to help, especially after I sent him my Karen fraud file. He looked it over and said I had more than enough for a formal complaint and potential lawsuit for harassment and attempted fraud. But that wasn't my goal, not yet. Instead, I told him to draft a formal cease and desist letter and a legal threat of action unless the law immediately rescinded all fines, and issued a formal apology in writing. We printed the letter and mailed it directly to the HOA address on file, which, surprise, turned out to be Karen's home. The day after she got the letter, she showed up at my door again, this time without Doug, just her holding the paper with trembling hands and her lips pursed like she'd bitten into a lemon. She said I had crossed a line, and now she would be forced to report me to the county board. I told her flat out, go ahead. She blinked. I said, you know what, Karen? In fact, why don't I save you the trouble? I already have a full report ready to go. Not just for the county, but for the Attorney General's office, the Real Estate Commission, and the local housing authority. I told her I had documented evidence of her illegally levying fees, falsifying board elections, and possibly embezzling Washington funds. Her face changed. She wasn't angry anymore. She was scared. She stammered and said, I didn't understand the pressures of managing a community, and that sometimes rules had to be bent to keep things running. I said, that's exactly the problem, Karen. You think you're above the rules. She stormed off, but not before saying something that would come back to haunt her. She turned at the edge of my driveway and said, "You'll regret messing with me. I know people and I always win." I smiled because now I knew she was desperate. That night, I mailed my lawyer again. We were going to push forward with an official complaint to the state, Wall Regulatory Board. And the next morning things really escalated. I woke up to the sound of tires screeching outside. I stepped out to find Karen standing in the middle of the street, waving her phone around screaming that I had threatened her. The neighbors were watching confused, a few recording with their phones. She called 911 again. She told the dispatcher I had threatened bodily harm, and she was afraid for her life. Within minutes, the squad cars showed up again. And once again I calmly explained the situation, and showed the cease and desist letter and the footage from my security cam that showed she had been the one yelling in my driveway, the officer's side. And one of them pulled her aside for a private conversation. I stood there arms crossed waiting. After about 10 minutes, the officer returned and told me I was free to go, and they were going to file a report, but not press charges. But the next words out of his mouth made my day. He said, "Just between you and me, sir, you may want to file a harassment complaint of your own. That woman's got a file a mile long with local PD for these kinds of calls." That's when I realized this wasn't her first time doing this. Karen was a repeat offender, and this time she picked the wrong guy to mess with. After that second 911 call, I knew Karen was spiraling. Her power trip was unraveling fast, but I also knew cornered people do reckless things, so I decided to speed things up. I found out there was a quarterly ward board meeting coming up on Thursday, open to all residents, held at the small community clubhouse just down the block. Perfect. I printed everything I had. Every document, every photo, every signed neighbor statement. I even printed out the HOA's own bylaws and highlighted every violation they'd committed. I wasn't going to go there to argue. I was going to go there to end this. When Thursday rolled around, I showed up early and sat near the front. A few neighbors I'd spoken to nodded to me quietly. The room filled up quick. Apparently word had spread that there was going to be a situation. Karen arrived 15 minutes late, wearing a bright red power blazer, sunglasses inside again, and holding that same clipboard like it was a shield. She strutted in and called the meeting to order. First 15 minutes were boring. Budget reports, landscaping contracts, talk about a new bench being installed near the walking path. Then she opened the floor for community concerns. I stood up. She immediately tensed. I introduced myself calmly. I said I was a new resident, and I had a few questions about recent board actions involving unauthorized billing, false notices, and improper fines. Karen tried to interrupt, but one of the older residents in the back called out, "Let him speak," so I did. I passed out copies of everything to each homeowner and board member, including Doug, who looked like he wanted to melt into his chair. I laid it all out: the illegal appointment of Karen as president, the financial records that hadn't been filed, the rat control bill that was charged to me illegally. I finished with the cease and desist letter and the statement from the police. After the second false 911 call, the room was dead silent. Then someone clapped, then two more. Then half the room. One woman stood up and said Karen had threatened her with fines for leaving a Halloween pumpkin out too long. Last year another man said he paid for a drainage audit. He later found out never happened. It was like a dam breaking. Complaint after complaint poured out, and Karen stood there trying to keep control, shouting that none of it was relevant, that I was attacking her personally, and that she would have everyone fined for disorderly conduct. That was her mistake, because the bylaws clearly stated the president could be removed by a 2/3 vote at any board meeting if cause was found, and cause had just been thoroughly found. I made the motion to remove her. Another resident seconded it. The vote was held right there in front of her. Out of the 32 residents in attendance, 26 voted to remove Karen as WAP president. She stood there shaking with rage. Her mouth opened like she wanted to scream, but no sound came out. And then someone asked the best question of the night. "Karen, where's all the money you've been collecting for the past 2 years?" She didn't answer. Instead, she stormed out of the clubhouse, clipboard in hand, knocking over a chair as she left. Doug resigned 5 minutes later without saying a word. The rest of the board elected an interim president, a retired school principal, who immediately announced an emergency audit of the HOA's finances. I left the meeting smiling for the first time in weeks. But I knew it wasn't over, because the next day I got a letter from Karen's personal lawyer. The letter arrived by certified mail. Cream-colored envelope, thick paper, heavy scent of desperation. It was from Karen's personal attorney. Or so it claimed. The letter was a 3-page tirade, filled with legal-sounding fluff and vague threats. It accused me of defamation, harassment, slander, and what they called targeted community destabilization. Apparently now I was a threat to the fabric of the neighborhood. The best part, they were demanding that I issue a formal written apology to Karen, pay her $5,000 in emotional damages, and retract all statements made at the Washington meeting. I laughed out loud. She was really trying to flip the narrative from being the villain to the victim, and she thought she could do it through intimidation. I handed the letter to my real lawyer, and he nearly choked on his coffee. He said the letter was basically a glorified tantrum and had no legal merit. But to be thorough, he sent a response, officially denying every point, and included a list of actual statutes Karen had violated under state law that shut things down fast. Karen didn't follow up with a lawsuit. She never filed a claim. Instead, she went quiet for 2 days. Then something strange happened. On the 3rd day after the letter, I saw her walking down the street in plain clothes. No sunglasses, no clipboard. She looked smaller, like someone who just come out the other side of a storm. She didn't look at me, just walked past, eyes on the ground. I thought maybe she'd given up. Maybe the fight was finally over. I was wrong again. That night around 1 a.m., I woke up to a noise. Banging, loud, echoing banging from my garage. I jumped up, threw on a shirt, grabbed my flashlight, and ran outside. Someone had kicked in the bottom panel of my garage door. They didn't get inside, but they left damage, dents, scratches, a chunk of siding torn clean off. There was a rock on the ground next to it, with the word liar scrolled across it in red paint. I called the police and filed a report. They took photos, looked around, but there were no cameras facing the street and no direct witnesses. But I knew who it was. I just couldn't prove it. So I did the next best thing. The following morning, I called the new interim WAP president and shared what happened. She was horrified. She promised to bring it up in the next emergency meeting. Then she asked if I would consider joining the board. At first I said no. I was tired, burned out, fed up with drama, but then I thought about it. If I joined the board, I'd have access to everything. Financial records, contract history, past complaints, all the things Karen had been hiding. So I said yes that week. I was voted in as secretary of the wall. It took less than a day to start unraveling her entire operation. First off, she'd been using wall funds for personal purchases. The board's debit card showed dozens of charges to online stores, including luxury candles, a $600 pair of boots, and what looked like a spa weekend under the label Wellness Committee Retreat. There was no wellness committee. Then I found something worse. Karen had sent out nearly $8,000 worth of fines over the past year to homeowners without any official board votes. She had pocketed nearly half of it in cash payments or checks made out to her personally. That was outright theft, and it didn't stop there. She had also falsified meeting minutes to show decisions the board never made. I compiled everything into a massive document dump and presented it to the new board. They were shocked, furious, determined. Within a week, we voted to refer the matter to the County Fraud Unit and filed an official complaint with the State Law Oversight Commission. Karen's quiet days were over. The following week, she was served with a subpoena. Neighbors started coming out of the woodwork, sharing their stories. One woman said Karen once threatened to fine her $500 for having a welcome mat that was not in aesthetic harmony with the community palette. No joke, that was the phrase she used. Another neighbor said Karen accused her teen son of vandalism with no proof and demanded he clean trash from the park as punishment. People were angry, and finally they were united. The neighborhood had gone from a place ruled by fear to a place ruled by facts. And Karen was on the outside now. But I wasn't done yet. There was one final piece of business. I filed a restraining order against her. Filing the restraining order wasn't just about the garage incident or the false 911 calls. It was about everything Karen had done. The pattern of harassment, the threats, the financial manipulation, the fear she instilled in the community. I provided the police reports, the witness statements, the emails, the board meeting transcript in the rock with liar, still stained with red paint. My lawyer helped me organize everything, and we filed it with the local court under grounds of harassment, intimidation, and property damage. The judge reviewed the evidence and, within 48 hours, granted a temporary restraining order. Karen was ordered to stay at least 150 feet away from me, my home, and any war-related activities or meetings until a formal hearing. She was served the papers at her front door by a county officer in front of several neighbors. Word spread fast Karen had gone from War Queen B to legally banned from her own kingdom. But the fallout wasn't over yet. 2 days after the restraining order was filed, the county fraud investigators showed up to interview board members. They reviewed all the financial records we'd uncovered, every shady payment, every unauthorized fee, every vendor with no invoice. The county investigator told us plainly, there were more than enough grounds to pursue criminal charges for embezzlement, fraud, and possibly obstruction of process if she tried to delete or withhold any documents. It was happening. Karen was about to face real accountability, and she knew it. She stopped showing her face entirely. Her blinds stayed closed, her car never moved. Neighbors said they saw her pacing inside at night, like a ghost haunting her own house. Then the hearing for the permanent restraining order came. She showed up in person, still wearing her red blazer, looking tired, angry, and shaken. She tried to speak directly to the judge about how I had turned the community against her and ruined her life. But the judge wasn't interested in emotional outbursts. He looked at the stack of evidence my lawyer handed him, including video clips from doorbell cameras, documentation of fines, illegal board actions, and the report from the HOA's own treasurer confirming financial misconduct. After reviewing the case, he made it official. A permanent restraining order was granted for a full year. Karen was no longer allowed to attend WAL meetings, contact me directly or indirectly, or walk anywhere near my property. And because she was no longer permitted to participate in Washington activities and couldn't fulfill any board functions, she was permanently banned from holding any future Washington position. It was over, but it didn't stop there. A month later, county investigators released their findings and handed their report over to the district attorney. They recommended formal charges of theft by deception, falsifying documents, and misuse of nonprofit funds. Karen was arrested, yes, actually arrested. She was picked up one morning and quietly booked and processed, while neighbors stared out their windows in disbelief. It hit the local newspaper. Small town headline, but still real. Former Washington president accused of fraud and misuse of community funds. She was released on bail, of course, but she was officially facing trial. And while she waited for that trial, her house, yet the one she ruled from like some Washington dictator, went up for sale, I guess. Paying legal fees is hard when you can't misuse one money anymore. But even that wasn't the final chapter. Because her fall changed the entire neighborhood. With Karen gone and the restraining order in place, the entire neighborhood started to breathe again. It was like the tension in the air had finally cleared. Neighbors who once kept to themselves out of fear now smiled, waved, and even stopped by to chat. The new interim board got to work fast. We set up a special audit committee, with help from residents who had backgrounds in finance and administration. A full forensic review of the HOA's records over the last 3 years was underway. We uncovered even more Karen-related mess. At least $19,000 in undocumented expenditures. Multiple payments to companies that didn't even exist. A few checks were made out to cash and signed in Karen's handwriting. One so-called vendor turned out to be her cousin's pressure washing company, which was never licensed and never did any work on the property. The audit committee prepared a complete report and turned it over to law enforcement as part of the ongoing case. The DA's office officially added 2 more charges to her case, one for financial misrepresentation and another for submitting false WAL minutes to the county. But while the legal system handled the punishment, our neighborhood focused on healing. We held a community town hall where everyone could come, share what they'd experienced under Karen's reign. People cried, some laughed nervously. One woman said she had been scared to decorate her porch for years because Karen once told her a red wreath was too aggressive for the wall color scheme. Another elderly man admitted he had been paying Karen $25 monthly in cash for a mailbox maintenance fee. There was no such thing in our bylaws. Every story added to the bigger picture. Karen didn't just abuse power, she thrived on controlling people's fear. We decided it would never happen again. We rewrote the Washington bylaws, the new rules. Made it mandatory for all board decisions to be documented publicly and recorded via email chain. We implemented term limits, so no one could serve more than 2 consecutive years in the same role. We made the WAL budget fully transparent, posted online with line-by-line expenses updated monthly. We even set up an anonymous complaint box where residents could report suspicious behavior or unfair treatment without fear of retaliation. And then we did something symbolic. We repainted the community bench near the front entrance. Karen had always insisted it stay beige. to match the earth tones of the property. So we painted it bright blue. It became a neighborhood joke, a small rebellion, a symbol of freedom. People started organizing weekend clean UPS, planting flowers along the sidewalks, fixing small things together instead of waiting for a board directive. Community spirit came alive. And me, the guy who had just moved in and refused to pay a stupid rat bill, I ended up becoming the full-time wall vice president. Not because I wanted power, but because I knew what happened when power went unchecked. Funny how things work out. I never thought I'd care about neighborhood politics or war rules, but now I saw how important it was when done right. How the smallest bit of attention to detail could stop someone like Karen from gaining control again. I thought it was over, that we'd finally put the drama behind us. But then I got a phone call from the county clerk. It was about Karen's trial and they wanted me to testify. The call from the county clerk came on a Thursday afternoon. The trial date had been set, and they were officially requesting that I testify as a primary witness in the case against Karen. I agreed without hesitation. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about everyone she had bullied, fined, threatened, and scammed. Over the next 2 weeks I worked closely with the DA's office. They wanted me to provide every document I had collected and walk them through the timeline, from the day Karen knocked on my door with that fake bill, to the restraining order and beyond. The DA was sharply seen small-time wall fraud before, but rarely anything so organized, so deliberately manipulative, and so personal. He told me Karen was facing 5 charges: fraudulent misuse of war funds, falsification of legal documents, theft by deception, filing false police reports, harassment of a private citizen. If found guilty, she could face up to 3 years in county jail, plus restitution and fines. When the court date finally arrived, the entire community was buzzing. People who had never stepped foot inside a courtroom showed up just to watch. The courthouse wasn't huge. It was a small local courtroom with folding chairs, a creaky floor, and fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, but to us it might as well have been the Supreme Court. Karen walked in wearing a gray pantsuit in her signature attitude, but the confidence was gone. Her eyes darted around the room. She didn't look at anyone directly. Her lawyer was clearly annoyed, probably because she had ignored his advice to settle out of court. The trial began with opening statements. Karen's defense tried to paint her as a concerned volunteer, overwhelmed by disorganization, and claimed that any financial inconsistencies were just honest mistakes. But then the DA stood up. He began laying out the receipts. Screenshots of altered meeting minutes, signed checks with no vendor invoices, copies of bogus violation notices, bank statements with spot charges labeled landscaping, recordings from meetings she never told the board about. And then it was my turn to testify. I walked up to the stand and swore in. The courtroom was silent. I told my story clearly, starting from the rat control bill, the fake violation, the fines, the threats, the 911 calls, the garage vandalism. I showed the documents, emails, and the printed WAV. She had violated every major rule, and then doubled down with threats and lies. Karen refused to look at me while I testified. Then came the other witnesses. Neighbor after neighbor came forward. A retired veteran who had been threatened with a lien because his flagpole was too tall. A single mom, fined $100 for putting up a birthday banner for her daughter. An elderly widow who paid Karen over $300 for a roof inspection that never happened. Every story chipped away at the defense. Then the DA played the final blow. A voicemail recording from Karen to Doug, the ex-treasurer. It was her voice without a doubt. I don't care what the bylaws say, Doug. They're not going to read it. They'll just pay it to avoid a fight. And if they don't, I'll fine them until they do. Her own words caught on tape. Game over. The defense attorney's face turned pale. Karen looked like she just watched her own house burn down. When closing arguments ended, the jury didn't even need a full day. They came back with a guilty verdict on 4 out of 5 charges. The judge revoked her bail immediately and ordered her into custody until sentencing. She didn't speak as they cuffed her and led her out of the courtroom. She didn't even look up as they walked her past me. She muttered the only words she'd spoken to me in months. This was supposed to be my neighborhood. But it wasn't, not anymore. 3 weeks after the guilty verdict, the courtroom reconvened for the sentencing hearing. It was standing room only. Neighbors who never cared about WAP politics came just to see how it would end. People brought coffee lawn chairs. A few even wore shirts that said "No more Karens." It felt less like a trial and more like the end of a saga. Karen was brought in wearing the county-issued jumpsuit, still trying to maintain the last scraps of her pride. She didn't look anyone in the eye, especially not me. Her lawyer stood up and tried one final Hail Mary. He told the judge Karen had no prior criminal record. She had simply been overwhelmed by the responsibility of managing a neighborhood alone, that her actions were the result of stress, not criminal intent. The judge didn't buy it. He read through the charges calmly and then turned to Karen directly. He said her actions weren't just illegal. They were deliberate manipulations of power, intended to silence and exploit people. She had used fear as a tool, weaponized by laws, and lied to the very people she was supposed to serve. He sentenced her to 18 months in county jail, plus 2 years of supervised probation, plus mandatory restitution of over $19,000 to the law, and a permanent ban from holding any position of authority in any registered law in the entire state. It was over. Karen didn't cry, didn't speak, just nodded slightly as the gavel came down. They let her out one last time, and this time nobody looked away. The room was quiet, then someone clapped. And soon the entire room followed. Not because we were happy she was in jail, but because it was finally done. Life after Karen. With Karen behind bars in the wall. Under new leadership, the neighborhood finally entered a golden age. No more random fines, no more fake notices. No more fear of painting your front door the wrong shade of blue. We rebuilt trust. We had monthly meetings where every homeowner could speak. We created a shared community fund for elderly neighbors who needed home repairs. We held BBQs. We built a dog park with leftover landscaping funds. The neighborhood went from quiet and divided to connected and strong. And me, the guy who refused to pay a rat bill. I was re-elected to the board the next year without even asking. People said they wanted someone who actually read the fine print. Karen's house eventually sold. The new owner is a retired firefighter who bakes cookies for the kids on the block. No more clipboards, no more power trips. No more wall dictatorship. In the bench, the one we painted bright blue. It stayed that way every time I walked past it. I remember what we went through. How close we came to letting one person control an entire community. And how one refusal to play along changed everything.